December 1944, Hurtgen Forest. German veteran Hans Müller survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, but nothing prepared him for what happened in those final 90 seconds. American shells that exploded exactly 20 feet above his foxhole, raining shrapnel straight down into defenses that were supposed to keep him safe, shredding his entire squad while he watched helplessly. These weren't ordinary artillery rounds. They were proximity-fused shells with miniature radar systems that hunted infantry in their holes, a weapon so advanced the Germans didn't even know it was possible. But here's what haunts survivors like Hans even more than that forest of death. If America could mass-produce throwaway technology more sophisticated than Germany's best fighter planes and use it as disposable ammunition by the millions, what did that reveal about how thoroughly they'd already lost a war their leaders swore they were winning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 1944. The frozen ground of the Hurtgen Forest felt like iron under Hans Müller's shovel. He was 22 years old, but his hands looked 50. Cracked skin, dirt under every nail, blood from blisters that never healed. He scraped at the rocky earth, trying to dig deeper, but the foxhole was already as deep as it would go. Maybe 3 feet down, just enough to crouch in if he pulled his knees to his chest. Hans came from Saxony, a small town where his father had worked in a factory making machine parts. That factory is gone now. British bombers turned it into rubble 2 years ago. His father died in the fires that swept through Hamburg. His mother's last letter, 3 months old, said there was no food except watery soup and black bread that tasted like sawdust. She didn't ask when he was coming home. Nobody asked that anymore. The squad around him was mostly boys. 17, 18, maybe 19 years old. Their uniforms hung loose on thin frames. One boy named Klaus had joined just 6 weeks ago. He still flinched at every distant boom. The Feldwebel, their sergeant, was older, maybe 35, with only one arm. He'd lost the other one on the Eastern Front, somewhere in the hell of Stalingrad. They sent him here to die with the children. Every man carried a Kar 98K rifle, the same bolt-action weapon their grandfathers used in the First War. 5 rounds in the magazine. You pulled the bolt back after each shot, ejecting the brass shell, loading the next round. It was reliable but slow. Across the forest, the Americans had rifles that fired 8 shots as fast as you could pull the trigger. They had so many bullets they could spray them like water from a hose. The squad had 1 machine gun between them, but no spare barrels and almost no ammunition. 3 belts, maybe 400 rounds total. In a real fight, that would last 10 minutes. Hans knew this because he'd survived Normandy, survived the retreat across France, survived a dozen disasters that shouldn't have been survivable. He was still alive because he was lucky, not because Germany was winning. The propaganda radio broadcasts said victory was certain. New wonder weapons would turn the tide any day now. The Führer had a plan. Just hold on a little longer. But Hans saw the truth in the sky every single day. American planes flew overhead in formations so thick they blocked out the sun. Hundreds of them. Nobody even shot at them anymore. What was the point? Germany had no fuel for fighters, no pilots left alive who knew how to fly them. At night, the horizon glowed orange from burning cities. American artillery fired constantly, thousands of shells, day after day, never stopping. Hans tried to imagine the factories that made all those shells. Factories that must be the size of whole towns. Factories with electric lights and machines that never broke down. While Germany melted church bells to make bullets, America was doing something Hans couldn't even picture in his mind. The foxholes stretched in a line through the forest, 50 yards between each position. They'd covered the tops with pine branches and frozen dirt, trying to camouflage them from the air. It was December, so everything was gray and white and dead. The trees stood like skeleton fingers reaching up. No birds sang, no animals moved. Just the distant rumble of guns and the closer sound of men coughing in the cold. Hans shared his hole with Klaus, the young one. The boy's hands shook when he loaded his rifle. Not from fear exactly, but from cold and hunger and exhaustion. They'd been in this position for 4 days with almost no sleep. The American artillery fired randomly at night just to keep them awake, to grind them down. It was working. The Feldwebel crawled along the line, checking each position. He moved awkwardly with only one arm, dragging himself through the snow. When he reached Hans, he whispered, "Stay sharp. They'll come soon. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. When they do, aim low and fire slow. Make every bullet count." Hans nodded. He'd heard this speech 100 times. Make every bullet count. As if their handful of rifles could stop an army with tanks and planes and endless ammunition. But what else could they do? Surrender meant a bullet in the back from the SS officers who lurked behind the lines, shooting deserters. Fight meant dying here in the frozen mud. There were no good choices left. Then the American artillery started up again, but this time it sounded different. Not the usual scream of incoming shells, but something higher pitched, almost like fireworks. Hans pressed himself flat in the foxhole as the first explosions rippled through the forest. They were close, maybe 200 yards away. He counted the seconds between each burst, trying to judge the pattern. Klaus whimpered beside him. "What is that? That's not normal shelling." Feldwebel's voice carried from the next hole over. "Just ranging shots. They're trying to find us. Stay down and stay quiet." But Hans noticed something wrong. The explosions weren't hitting the ground. They were bursting in the air, maybe 20 or 30 feet up, right at treetop level. Every single one. Not random, not scattered. Precise. Like someone was setting the fuses by hand for the exact perfect height. The barrage crept closer. Each explosion threw branches and dirt and something else into the air. Metal fragments that hissed through the trees like angry wasps. Hans heard screaming from the left where the next squad was dug in. Then silence. Then more screaming farther down the line. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was different. This was something new. The Americans had invented something that changed everything about how men hid from shells. 20 feet above the ground, every time. Exactly right. To rain death straight down into holes that were supposed to be safe. Klaus grabbed his arm. "Hans, what do we do?" Hans opened his mouth to answer, but the world exploded into light and noise and pain, and there was no time left for answers. The barrage lasted 90 seconds. Hans counted every one of them while the forest turned into hell. The shells burst overhead with sharp cracks that punched his eardrums. Hot metal fragments sliced through the air in every direction at once. They came down like steel rain, thousands of pieces from each explosion, shredding everything below. The pine branches covering his foxhole vanished in the first 5 seconds. After that, there was nothing between him and the sky except luck. Klaus stopped screaming after the 3rd shell. Hans didn't look at him, couldn't look, just pressed himself into the frozen dirt and waited to die. Feldwebel's voice cut off mid-shout. The machine gun team never fired a single round. When the explosions finally stopped, the silence felt louder than the noise had been. Hans lay still for a long time. His ears rang. Something warm ran down his left arm. When he finally moved, pain shot through his shoulder and side. Shrapnel, multiple pieces. He could feel them under his skin like bits of broken glass. He forced himself to sit up and immediately wished he hadn't. The boy next to him was gone. Not dead, just gone. What was left wasn't Klaus anymore, just meat and cloth and things Hans's brain refused to recognize. He climbed out of the foxhole on shaking legs. Every position he could see was the same. Bodies torn apart by metal that had fallen from above. The Feldwebel lay on his back, staring at nothing, his chest opened like a book. Down the line, one soldier was trying to crawl with no legs. Another sat against a tree, holding his stomach, making small, surprised sounds. American voices shouted in the distance. Hans raised his hands above his head. He had no weapon anymore, no helmet, no will to fight. When the first American soldier came through the trees, rifle raised, Hans expected a bullet. The propaganda said Americans executed prisoners, shot them, and left them in ditches. Instead, the soldier lowered his rifle and yelled, "Medic, we got wounded here." A man with a red cross on his helmet appeared within minutes. He looked at Hans's bloody uniform and pulled out supplies from a bag that seemed bottomless. Sulfa powder went into the shrapnel wounds. It burned like fire, but Hans didn't make a sound. The medic wrapped white bandages around his arm and gave him a shot of something that made the pain fade to a distant throb. Morphine. Real morphine. The Wehrmacht had run out of that 6 months ago. What shocked Hans most was how the medic threw things away. Used bandages went on the ground. The empty morphine syringe got tossed into the bushes. Half a roll of gauze got left behind because it touched the dirt. In the German army, they would have washed that gauze and used it again. They would have saved the bandages, boiled them clean, reused them until they fell apart. Here, the Americans treated medical supplies like they grew on trees. They loaded Hans and 2 other survivors onto a truck, a real truck with a canvas top and actual springs in the seats. It ran smooth and quiet, no grinding gears, no clouds of smoke. The driver was chewing gum. Hans watched him pop a bubble and wondered when he'd last seen anyone waste food on something you didn't even swallow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The temporary camp in Belgium was a field of tents surrounded by barbed wire. They took Hans to a medical tent where a doctor examined his wounds under electric lights powered by a humming generator. Electric lights in a tent. The doctor spoke no German, but pointed at things and Hans understood. The shrapnel had to come out. They put a mask over his face and told him to breathe. When Hans woke up, the metal pieces were in a small dish beside the cot. 7 fragments. They'd cut them out while he slept. No pain, no screaming, just clean stitches and fresh bandages. The first meal arrived on a metal tray. White bread. Not the brown sawdust bread from home, but actual white bread made from real wheat flour. A can of meat that said Spam on the side. Coffee with sugar. Real sugar, not the burned grain substitute Germany called coffee. Hans stared at the food for a full minute before eating. There was more on this one tray than he'd seen in a week. Other prisoners around him were crying while they ate, shoving food into their mouths with shaking hands. An older prisoner named Friedrich stood beside him at the fence. Friedrich had been a factory manager before the war. He said quietly, "Do you understand what you're seeing? This isn't just wealth. This is a different world. They make so much of everything that waste doesn't matter. We were trying to defeat people who can afford to throw things away." That night, Hans lay in his bunk and did math in his head. Each proximity shell that killed his squad contained electronics, miniature radios that sensed the ground and triggered the explosion at exactly the right height. The Americans fired thousands of these shells every day, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Each one more complex than anything Germany put in its fighter planes, and they used them once and never thought about them again. Hans finally understood. Germany hadn't been fighting a richer enemy. They'd been fighting an enemy from the future, an enemy so far ahead that the gap couldn't be measured in numbers. It could only be measured in waste, in bandages thrown away, in sugar water left unfinished, in shells too sophisticated to comprehend, fired like they cost nothing at all. The war was over. It had been over before it started. Hans just hadn't known it until American abundance saved his life. Christmas morning 1944 came cold and gray to the POW camp in England. Hans woke expecting the usual breakfast of porridge and bread. Instead, the guards told them to wash up and report to the dining hall at noon. Something special was happening. The prisoners whispered among themselves, uncertain and suspicious. Speciality in wartime usually meant bad news. When Hans entered the dining hall, he stopped walking. Long tables were covered with white cloths. Real plates sat at each spot, not the usual metal trays. The smell hit him next. Roasted meat. His mouth watered before his brain could catch up. American soldiers were carrying out platters of turkey, bowls of mashed potatoes, gravy boats, stuffed vegetables, and baskets of rolls. Pies sat cooling on a side table. Apple, pumpkin, cherry. The kind of feast Hans remembered from childhood, from before the war made hunger normal. A man in the next cot said his name was Otto. He'd been captured 3 days earlier near Aachen. "They asked what I wanted to eat," Otto whispered. "Can you believe that? They asked, like we were guests at a restaurant." Hans couldn't believe any of it. The abundance felt like a magic trick. Where did it all come from? How could they have so much? He thought about the American medic throwing away bandages. The doctor used anesthesia on a German prisoner. The white bread and canned meat handed out like it cost nothing. After 2 weeks, they moved Hans to a larger camp. The convoy that took them there stretched for a mile. Dozens of trucks, all new, all running perfectly. Hans counted them until he lost track. In his old unit, they'd shared one half-broken truck between 3 companies. That truck broke down every other day, and they had no parts to fix it. These American trucks looked like they just rolled out of a factory yesterday. Maybe they had. The new camp in England had wooden barracks with real bunks and mattresses. Not comfortable exactly, but better than frozen ground. There was a shower building with hot water. Hot water! Hans stood under the spray for 20 minutes, watching 2 years of dirt and blood wash away, until a guard knocked on the door and told him other men were waiting. They gave the prisoners Red Cross packages once a week. Each box contained chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned fruit, crackers, and cheese. Hans saved his first chocolate bar for 3 days before eating it. The taste made him think of childhood, of Christmas before the war, of a world that seemed like a dream now. Other prisoners traded cigarettes for extra food or for favors. The economy inside the camp ran on American abundance. One afternoon, a Coca-Cola truck arrived to deliver cases of bottles to the American guards. Hans watched through the fence as soldiers grabbed bottles from wooden crates, popped the caps, and drank. Some of them didn't finish their bottles, just set them down half full and walked away. Hans couldn't stop staring. They were throwing away sugar water because they had too much of it. An American chaplain stood at the front of the room. He was a short man with kind eyes and a terrible German accent. He cleared his throat and said in broken German, "Today is Christmas, day of peace on earth. You are far from home, we know this. But today you eat like men, not prisoners. No speeches, no politics, just food and peace. Please, sit." Hans sat slowly, like the chair might disappear if he moved too fast. Other prisoners did the same, their faces showing confusion and something close to pain. Otto sat across from him, staring at the turkey platter like it might be poisoned. Friedrich, the old factory manager, had tears in his eyes. The Americans served them. Actual soldiers walked around with platters and served German prisoners like they were guests. Hans took turkey, potatoes, gravy, carrots, and a roll with butter. Real butter, not the gray margarine that tasted like candle wax. His plate filled up until there was no white space left. He picked up his fork and couldn't make his hand move. This was more food than his mother had seen in a year. More food than his squad in the Herdgen forest would have eaten in a month. And it was being given to prisoners, to the enemy. Otto whispered, "Why are they doing this?" Hans had no answer. He took a bite of turkey. It was hot and juicy and seasoned with herbs. He chewed slowly, tasting every second of it. Around him, other men were eating and crying at the same time. Some prayed. Some just stared at their plates in silence. The Americans didn't watch them with suspicion. They just brought more food when a platter emptied. After the meal, the chaplain said grace. He thanked God for peace, for food, for the hope that men who fought today might be friends tomorrow. He didn't mention Germany's sins. He didn't talk about punishment or justice. He just talked about peace. Then he wished them frohe Weihnachten in his broken German and left. Hans sat at the table long after the meal ended. His stomach was full for the first time in 2 years, but his mind was spinning in circles, trying to understand. The Americans had every right to hate them. German submarines had sunk their ships. German bombs had killed their soldiers. The war was Germany's fault, started by German choice, and now Germany was losing, and everyone knew it. Yet here sat Hans, a German soldier, eating turkey and pie on Christmas Day because Americans decided to be kind. He thought about the propaganda he'd believed, the speeches about Anglo-American weakness, about how democracy made nations soft, about how only the strong German spirit could win against decadent enemies who loved comfort more than duty. But those soft, decadent Americans had built weapons Germany couldn't imagine. They had an economy so powerful they could feed enemy prisoners turkey dinners for no reason except it was Christmas. And they'd done it without being asked, without demanding anything in return. That night, Hans lay in his bunk and thought about the forest, about Klaus and the Feldwebel and all the boys torn apart by shells that exploded exactly 20 feet up. He thought about his father burning to death in Hamburg. His mother was eating watery soup. His country is in ruins because a failed painter convinced millions of people to burn Europe for his ego. The proximity fuses made sense now. They weren't cruel, they were just effective. They killed quickly and precisely to save American soldiers from dying. A wealthy nation with advanced science used its advantages to protect its own men. That was rational. That was what a country did when it valued its people more than its pride. Germany had done the opposite. They'd spent boys like bullets because they had more boys than bullets. They'd sent children into meat grinders and called it honor. They'd starved their own people and called it sacrifice. And for what? For a man who couldn't paint. For an ideology built on hate. For dreams of an empire that never made sense. Hans pulled out a scrap of paper he'd saved and a pencil stub. He wrote in small letters, thinking through each word. We were told we fought for civilization. But civilization doesn't waste its children. Civilization doesn't burn its cities for one man's anger. The Americans have more of everything because they built instead of conquered. They value life instead of death. I see that now. I saw it at a turkey dinner. I saw it in the medic who threw away bandages. I saw it in shells so advanced they seemed like magic. We didn't lose because we weren't brave enough. We lost because we chose wrong from the very beginning. He folded the paper and hid it in his boot. Someday, if he made it home, he wanted to remember this moment. The moment when everything he'd believed cracked apart and something new grew in its place. Friedrich found him the next week in the camp library. The old man carried a smuggled newspaper, 3 days old, from London. He showed Hans an article about concentration camps being liberated, places called Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. The photographs showed things Hans's mind rejected: mountains of bodies, living skeletons behind wire, children with hollow eyes. Hans wanted to say it was propaganda, lies to make Germany look evil. But the math was there in black and white. The scale matched what he'd seen of American production. Both were industrial processes, one making weapons, one making death. Both represented efficiency beyond anything his small-town mind had understood. Some of the SS prisoners went silent when shown the pictures. They didn't deny it. They just stopped talking. That silence told Hans everything he needed to know. Other prisoners formed quiet groups in corners of the camp. Social democrats who'd been drafted against their will. Older officers who'd seen through the lies years ago. Austrians who never wanted any of this. They passed around newspapers and talked about what came next. About trials being planned in Nuremberg. About rebuilding Germany into something worth living in instead of dying for. About the Atlantic Charter and rumors of American aid to rebuild Europe. Hans joined these talks. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, he told the truth. He told them about the proximity fuses, about the endless trucks and the thrown-away bandages and the Christmas dinner, about an enemy so wealthy they could afford to be merciful, about what that meant for Germany's future. An old Wehrmacht colonel said something Hans never forgot. The Russians will make us pay for our crimes with blood. The Americans will make us pay with embarrassment. They'll feed us, rebuild us, and make us watch while they prove democracy works better than everything we believed. That might be the harder punishment. Hans understood. Vengeance was easy to hate. Kindness was impossible to fight. The Americans weren't just defeating Germany with weapons. They were defeating the idea of Germany with proof that another way worked better, that abundance beat scarcity, that building beat conquering, that mercy beats hate. He thought about going home someday, about what he'd find there. Ruins, probably. Hunger, certainly. His mother, if she'd survived. A country that would have to look at itself in the mirror and face what it had become. But maybe, if they were lucky, they could build something new from the ashes, something that Hans learned in a prison camp while eating turkey on Christmas Day. The war would end soon. Everyone knew it. The only question was what came after. Hans had his answer now. After came the hard work of proving you could change, of showing that a nation could choose differently, of becoming the kind of people who threw away bandages because life mattered more than efficiency. He folded his secret paper smaller and tucked it deep in his boot. Someday, if he made it home, he'd need those words to remember why he changed his mind, why he stopped believing in glory and started believing in something harder, something like hope. The train carrying Hans home crossed into Germany in May 1946. He pressed his face against the window and watched his country roll past like a nightmare. Every city was broken. Factory walls stood without roofs. Church steeples leaned at strange angles. Bridges dropped into rivers, their steel bones twisted like broken fingers. Children in rags picked through rubble piles, looking for anything to sell or burn. Old women pulled carts because there were no horses left. The train moved slowly because so many tracks were damaged. Sometimes they stopped for hours while workers cleared debris from the rails. Hans carried everything he owned in a canvas duffel bag stamped with American markings. Inside were 3 bars of Red Cross soap, a wool blanket with U.S. Army printed on it, his discharge papers, and a harmonica he'd traded from a guard for 2 cigarettes. He also carried the folded paper in his boot, the one with his written thoughts from Christmas. And he carried something heavier that had no weight at all, the knowledge that this destruction was earned, that Germany had started a war and lost it completely. The train was supposed to take him to Chemnitz, his hometown in Saxony, but Chemnitz was in the Soviet zone now. Hans had heard stories from other prisoners about what the Russians were doing in the east, taking men to Siberia, dismantling factories and shipping them to Moscow, arresting anyone who'd been a soldier or a party member or just looked at them wrong. Friedrich had warned him, "Don't go east. The Russians remember what we did to them. They won't forgive like the Americans did." So Hans got off the train in the British zone instead. He walked through towns he didn't know, sleeping in bombed-out buildings, eating from his Red Cross rations until they ran out. Then he ate soup from church kitchens that fed refugees. The soup was thin, mostly water and potato peels, but it was hot. Everyone in line looked the same. Thin faces, hollow eyes, old clothes held together with string. He made it to Hamburg after 2 weeks of walking, the city his father had died in. Hans stood at the edge of what used to be a neighborhood and saw nothing but flat ground and rubble, miles of it. The firebombing had erased entire districts. He tried to find the factory where his father had worked, but couldn't even locate the street. Everything was gone, just ashes and broken bricks and weeds growing through the cracks. A British soldier at a checkpoint told him they needed workers to clear rubble, 50 pennies a day plus a meal. Hans took the job. He spent his days moving bricks, one at a time, loading them onto carts that other men pulled to collection points. The work was hard and pointless. They'd been moving bricks for a year and barely made a dent. But it was something to do, something that felt like moving forward even when you were just cleaning up the past. He worked next to men who'd been soldiers, sailors, factory workers, teachers. Nobody talked about what they'd done in the war. Nobody asked. They just moved bricks and ate their watery soup and went to sleep in refugee shelters that smelled like sweat and defeat. At night, Hans heard women crying. He heard children coughing. He heard old men praying in whispers. In November 1946, Hans met Anna. She was moving bricks 3 rows over, her hands wrapped in cloth because she had no gloves. Her face was thin, but her eyes were strong. During the lunch break, she sat near him and shared a piece of bread. He asked where she was from. She said Cologne. Her husband had died at Stalingrad. Her apartment had burned in a bombing raid. She'd walked to Hamburg because someone said there was work here. They talked every day after that. Short conversations during breaks. Nothing romantic at first. Just 2 people who'd survived telling each other they were still alive. Hans told her about the proximity fuses and the Christmas dinner. Anna told him about the night Cologne burned, how she'd hidden in a cellar while the city above her turned to ash. Neither of them cried when they talked. They were past crying, but they listened, and listening was enough. They married in April 1947 in a church with no roof. The wall still stood, but the ceiling was open sky. A British chaplain performed the ceremony in English and German. Hans had no ring to give her. Anna wore a dress she'd sewn from an old curtain. 10 people attended, all of them workers from the rubble crews. After the ceremony, they ate a wedding meal of Spam and canned vegetables from care packages. American surplus feeding Germany's survivors. Hans thought about the irony and decided it was fitting. They'd destroyed themselves, and now their enemies were keeping them alive. Anna gave birth to their son in December 1948. They named him Peter. He was born in a hospital rebuilt by the British, delivered by a German doctor using American medical supplies. When Hans held his son for the first time, he thought about Klaus in the Foxhole, about all the boys who never got to be fathers, about the future that proximity fuses had stolen from them, but also about the future Peter might have, a future without war, without hate, without stupid ideas about blood and soil. By 1950, everything started changing fast. The Marshall Plan poured money into Western Germany. New buildings went up where ruins had stood. Factories reopened with American machines. The shops had food again, real food, white bread, meat, butter, chocolate for children. Hans got promoted to foreman on a crew rebuilding Hamburg's port. He watched new cranes unload containers from American ships, watched forklifts move pallets of goods, watched his country come back to life on American money and American generosity. He tried not to think about why America was doing this. The answer was obvious. They needed West Germany strong to face the Soviet Union. It was strategy, not kindness. But Hans didn't care about the reasons anymore. He cared that Peter would grow up with food and school and a future. That was enough. His son grew up in the Federal Republic, a new country bound to the West. Peter learned English in school. He ate American candy and watched American movies and listened to American music on the radio. He knew nothing about the war except what Hans told him, and Hans told him very little. Just enough so he'd understand. Just enough so he'd never want to repeat it. In 1989, Hans was 67 years old. He sat in his apartment in Hamburg watching television as the Berlin Wall came down. Young people were smashing it with hammers and dancing on top of it. East meeting West, Russia letting go. The crowd sang and cried and waved German flags. Hans watched and felt nothing at first. Then he felt something unexpected: relief. His grandson, Peter's son, was 22, the same age Hans had been in the Hurtgen forest. But instead of dying in a foxhole, the boy wore a Bundeswehr uniform and was training to deploy with NATO peacekeepers. German soldiers serving alongside Americans and British and French. Old enemies working together. Hans couldn't quite believe it. The change was too big, too complete. He thought about the proximity fuses one more time, about the technology that had killed his friends and taught him the hardest lesson of his life. That power wasn't about willingness to suffer. It was about capacity to build. Germany had spent 6 years proving they could endure pain. America had spent 4 years proving they didn't have to. They'd made weapons so advanced they could waste them by the millions. They'd built an economy so strong they could feed prisoners turkey dinners and rebuild enemy nations and still have enough left over to win the peace. The real weapon wasn't the fuse. It was the society that made it. A place so rich it could be generous, so confident it could be merciful, so advanced it could turn enemies into allies just by proving its way worked better. Hans had surrendered to that society in a frozen forest in 1944. Germany had surrendered to it in 1945. And now, 45 years later, even the Soviets were surrendering to it. Not with guns, just with the slow recognition that abundance beat poverty, that freedom beat control, that building beat destruction. Hans pulled the old paper from his desk drawer, the one he'd written on Christmas Day, 1944. The words were faded but still readable. He read them one more time, then folded the paper and put it back. His grandson would find it someday after Hans was gone. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe he wouldn't. But the lesson was there for anyone who wanted to learn it. The future belongs to those who build, not those who merely endure. That's what the proximity fuses taught. That's what America proved. That's what Germany finally learned. And that knowledge, bought with blood and ruins and 45 years of hard rebuilding, was the real legacy of the war. Not the battles or the speeches or the flags, just the simple truth that mercy wins in the end, that kindness is stronger than hate, that the side with throwaway technology and turkey dinners will always defeat the side that treats humans as throwaway resources. Hans turned off the television and went to bed. Outside his window, Hamburg glowed with electric lights. His grandson would deploy to keep peace instead of making war. His son had never known hunger. And somewhere in America, the country that had saved him by defeating him, people were living their lives without thinking about any of this. That was fine. Hans would remember all of them. He'd remember what the proximity fuses really killed. Not just soldiers in foxholes, but the old way of thinking, the old lies about glory, the old dream that conquest could ever lead anywhere except ruin. Those ideas died in the Hurtgen forest, along with Klaus and the Feldwebel and all the other boys who never came home. And in their place, slowly, painfully, something better grew, something worth keeping, something called peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.